Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about a neighbor who built a swimming pool on my land. My place was a large wooded tract that extended farther than the eye could see from the back of the house. It wasn't some small backyard patch. It was a genuine stretch of rolling greenery, a patchwork of mature trees, a few dirt trails that wound around gentle hills, and even a small pond that sat at the far edge. You could walk for 20 minutes and still not reach the end of the land's boundary. For someone who was used to living shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who could eavesdrop on your every conversation, this was pure bliss. I spent many weekends just exploring my own property. I discovered a small clearing tucked away beyond a row of tall pines, which was perfect for picnics on warm summer afternoons. I liked to take my nieces and nephews there when they visited, letting them run wild as we enjoyed a family day out in the open. Sometimes we set up a volleyball net, or we tried to identify different bird species flying overhead. It was more than just land, it was a sanctuary. I had put a lot of money, time, and care into making it my dream place, so I never imagined someone would have the nerve to encroach on it. My nearest neighbor is a man named Marvin. He's about 10 years older than me, has a bit of a pompous streak, but I never had huge issues with him when I first moved in. In fact, the first time we spoke, he approached me with a big grin, offering me some produce from his home garden. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a little too chatty for my taste, but at least he tried to be welcoming. Later, I learned he ran a contracting business, employing a handful of people for local construction or renovation work. Over time, though, I noticed how he carried himself like he was untouchable. He would brag about how he could do things without anyone noticing, and how neighbors never messed with him because they wanted to stay on his good side. I chalked it up to him having a big ego and never anticipated he'd do something truly outrageous. The start of this whole fiasco was so subtle that I almost missed it. One morning, I was out walking my land with my friend Colton, who's an amateur photographer. Colton wanted to take pictures of the sunrise through the trees, so we decided to explore deeper into the property. As we navigated around a few thorny bushes and came across one of my lesser-used trails, I heard the faint sound of machinery. It was like an electric hum of a power tool, maybe a saw or a drill. I was surprised because I rarely heard anything like that out in my woods, especially at dawn. I strained my ears and followed the noise. Suddenly, I noticed an area that had been cleared further ahead. The closer we got, the more bizarre it seemed. It looked as if someone was setting up a construction site right in the middle of my land. At first, I thought maybe there was some city project I didn't know about. But that didn't make sense. There should have been official notices, or at least some mention to me about workers coming onto my property. Colton and I kept walking until we reached a boundary where some new fencing had mysteriously gone up. It was nowhere near where my property ended, so it definitely wasn't the perimeter fence. The fence was new, with bright metal posts hammered into the ground, and behind it I saw a half-built structure and a huge rectangular hole. My stomach twisted in confusion. It wasn't just a makeshift shack or a hunting blind. It looked like the skeleton of a pool house and the beginnings of an in-ground pool. The bright turquoise pool liner was stacked in rolls near the hole, along with bags of cement. I remember feeling this sense of shock, like I was in one of those weird dreams that defy logic. I'd never authorized any kind of construction here, and to my knowledge, I hadn't sold or leased any part of my land to Marvin, or anyone else. My first suspicion was that maybe these workers had gotten the wrong property, but as soon as I glanced around for any signage, I saw a big rectangular sign hammered into a wooden stake. The sign read something like, "Property of Marvin's Contracting, construction in progress, keep out." I thought I might pass out from astonishment. How on earth could Marvin be so brazen? I went around the fence looking for the head contractor or someone who could explain. There was a small crew of about 3 men, each one looking just as perplexed as I was when they saw me approach. They probably knew I wasn't part of Marvin's operation. My expression alone gave me away. I asked them, "What are you doing here?" The guys exchanged glances, and one of them, presumably the site manager, told me that Marvin had instructed them to begin the in-ground pool for a private retreat. According to him, Marvin claimed that section of land was his. "This is my land," I interjected. The site manager's face went pale. He insisted Marvin had said otherwise. He even showed me a rough blueprint that had our property line redrawn to incorporate that area under Marvin's address. It looked obviously altered to me, and I pointed out that the blueprint was not an official city plan, but a sketched-up piece of paper with dubious notations. The manager seemed genuinely concerned, like he'd been misled. Without wanting to make a scene, I decided to let them know I would handle it with Marvin directly. Colton and I turned around and hightailed it back to my house. We were both stunned. I spent the better part of that morning trying to figure out how best to confront Marvin. I decided to send him a text first, just to see if he would own up to what he was doing. He responded breezily, saying something like, "Yeah, I figured I'd expand a bit. It's not a big deal, is it?" I was floored. Expand a bit? This was my property he was expanding onto. I told him I needed him to stop immediately and remove all construction materials. That conversation quickly escalated into a heated exchange, with him insisting he had some form of claim to the land because it was practically vacant. He even dared to say, "You won't even notice I'm there." I ended the conversation by warning him that I'd be in touch with my attorney if he didn't cease construction. The days following that were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and increasingly tense face-to-face meetings. Marvin was completely defiant. He refused to remove his fencing or construction materials. Worse, his crew kept working, albeit at a slower pace, probably because they sensed the legal trouble brewing. I attempted to involve local authorities, and an officer came by to document the trespassing and unauthorized construction. While that helped me build a case, it didn't immediately halt the work. Marvin had enough swagger to keep pushing, apparently convinced he could outmaneuver me. At one point, he offered me a small sum, something insulting like $5,000, for permanent permission to keep the pool. I refused outright. The nerve of this guy was unbelievable. I decided it was time to take legal action. I hired an attorney named Tristan, someone recommended by a close friend who had dealt with property disputes before. Tristan was both methodical and thorough. He helped me file for an injunction to force Marvin to stop construction. Yet, by the time it was granted, Marvin had already installed the pool shell and was working on finishing touches. It was utterly insane how fast he and his crew had thrown this together. What made it all the more outrageous was the fact that Marvin had put up some fancy landscaping around the perimeter. He had decorative stone paths leading from his backyard to this newly constructed pool area. Except that path clearly crossed into my property by at least 30 or 40 feet. Marvin had practically built himself a private vacation oasis right in my woods, and he had the audacity to claim it was on unused land, so it shouldn't matter. When the court date finally arrived, I was more than ready to put an end to this entire fiasco. Marvin, apparently, was set on doubling down rather than apologizing or admitting wrongdoing. He hired his own lawyer, tried to argue that the property lines were ambiguous or that he'd performed an unofficial land swap with the former owner of my property. That was so blatantly false that the judge looked exasperated. All the official paperwork showed that I owned the land fair and square, with no such arrangement listed anywhere. During those tense days in court, Marvin's stubbornness was on full display. However, Tristan and I were well prepared. We produced documents demonstrating my clear property boundaries, satellite images that matched the official county records, and even testimony from the prior owner who confirmed that no deal had ever been made with Marvin regarding that patch of land. The evidence was undeniable. The court found that Marvin had indeed trespassed and built on my land without permission. But here's where an interesting twist came in. Rather than ordering him to tear it all down immediately, which was what I wanted at first, the judge suggested that maybe we could reach an arrangement, since the pool was already built, and removing it might be more complicated and costly. At first, I was reluctant. It felt unfair that Marvin got to keep something he built without any respect for me or my property. However, Tristan pointed out that we could demand a hefty sum in compensation, possibly far beyond what that piece of land would ever be worth. We hashed out negotiations, with Tristan taking a firm stance that if Marvin wanted to keep the pool, he had to pay dearly for it. Eventually, Marvin realized that he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he refused to pay, the court could force him to remove the pool and restore the land to its original state, which would cost him tens of thousands. If he tried to haggle for a lower price, we had enough evidence to bury him in legal fees, and he'd still lose the pool. So, in a rather unexpected turn, Marvin caved in. We reached an agreement. He would pay me $75,000 for the right to keep and use the pool, but he would not own the land. He would only buy the permanent right of access to that portion of my property, while the actual deed would remain in my name. To clarify for anyone reading this, $75,000 is an astronomically higher figure than what that tiny patch of land was worth on the open market. It probably would have sold for maybe $8,000 or $10,000 given how remote it was. But because he was in such a bind, we set the price at $75,000. He agreed, and the judge signed off on the deal. I'll admit, getting that $75,000 check felt like a moral victory as much as a financial one. I remember thinking, well, at least something good came out of Marvin's arrogance. The contract clearly stated that while Marvin could keep the pool and come onto that section of land whenever he liked, the property itself was still mine. If I wanted to stroll down to that area, I was allowed to. The arrangement effectively made him a tenant, albeit of a very specific portion of land that included the pool's footprint. Since my overall property was so large and I seldom ventured all the way out there, I figured I wouldn't even notice his presence. And if I did, the compensation was more than worth the minor inconvenience. For a brief moment, I thought we had achieved a truce. Marvin paid up, and I assumed he'd calm down after that financial blow. But in true Marvin style, he found a way to push the envelope again. You see, the contract wasn't just some informal handshake. We had a legally binding agreement that stated I retained ownership, and I had the right to access the pool area whenever I wished, of course with reasonable notice and at reasonable times, so it didn't become a harassment scenario. It was an important clause to ensure that he didn't start treating it like his own private island. What happened next was the last thing I expected. A few months after the settlement, I was having a small gathering at my place for a friend's birthday. We thought it might be fun to go on a short nature walk across the property, so I led a group of about 4 or 5 friends through my trails. We eventually wound up near Marvin's pool area. The day was warm, and the pool looked inviting. I joked, "Hey, I do technically have access rights to that pool. Should we take a quick dip?" My friends laughed, not sure if I was serious. But I wanted to see if Marvin would be open to me exercising my right to use it. After all, that's how the contract was written. I approached the gate. It was locked. Well, no problem. I had a key, which Tristan had advised me to get as part of the settlement, but Marvin never gave me one. That was already a violation of our agreement. It was supposed to be open for me with prior notice, so I knocked, hoping Marvin or someone in his family might let me in. Instead, Marvin came out to the gate, looking like he'd swallowed a sour lemon. He was furious that I'd even shown up. He said, "You can't just barge in here. This is my pool and I paid for it." I responded calmly, "You don't own this land, Marvin. The contract says I can use the pool, remember?" He shot back, "I'm not letting you set foot in here. I paid good money and I won't have you intruding whenever you please." I tried to remain composed, but inside I was boiling. I reminded him, "I have a legal right. If you refuse, you're in breach of contract." He scoffed and told me to go ahead and sue him, then slammed the gate in my face. My friends looked at me confused and I just sighed. It was obvious that Marvin thought he could bully me again, but I wasn't about to let this slide. I contacted Tristan the following Monday, explained the situation, and we reviewed the contract. Sure enough, the language was crystal clear that I retained ownership, and Marvin had to allow me access to the pool area as long as I provided him with notice. I had tried to do exactly that. Tristan grinned when he heard the story, saying, "So he basically gave us another gift. Because refusing to allow me in was a direct breach of the contract, we had grounds to sue him all over again." The same judge, upon hearing the facts, would likely rule in my favor without much hesitation. Before filing another lawsuit, we decided to give Marvin one last chance to comply. Tristan sent him a formal letter, reminding him of the contract terms and demanding that he provide me a key and guarantee access by a certain date. We also mentioned that if he failed to comply, we would seek damages and possibly attorney's fees for the breach. We hoped that would be enough for him to relent, but Marvin, being Marvin, responded with a terse note claiming, "I paid you the $75,000. That should be enough. This is my pool, and I get to decide who uses it." That response sealed his fate. We filed suit for breach of contract and the case went to a short hearing. This time, Marvin didn't have the advantage of plausible deniability. He had signed the agreement himself. He couldn't claim ignorance or boundary confusion. His refusal to allow me access was a blatant violation. The judge, reading the signed contract and hearing the story, ruled in my favor almost immediately, awarding me an additional $15,000 in damages. The judge's logic was that Marvin's stubborn refusal had cost me attorney's fees, court fees, and also deprived me of the enjoyment of my own property. I still remember Marvin's face as the judge read out the verdict. He looked positively stunned. Not only did he have to pay me more money, but he now had to comply with the contract or face even steeper penalties. After that, I'll admit the tension between us was sky high. Marvin tried to stonewall me for a while, leaving the gate locked and refusing to hand over a key. But Tristan was ready to file contempt charges if he kept it up. Eventually, Marvin conceded, and a week later I received a small, padded envelope with a single key inside, along with a letter from Marvin's lawyer assuring me that from now on, we'd all respect the terms of the contract. But that didn't erase the animosity. To this day, Marvin and I rarely speak. When we do cross paths, it's always awkward, and I can tell he still resents the fact that he had to pay $90,000 total, the initial $75,000 plus the additional $15,000, for a pool that sits on land he doesn't even own. That might have been the entire story if it weren't for the fact that Marvin continued to try and push his luck in smaller, more passive-aggressive ways. For instance, I noticed that whenever I'd try to schedule a day to use the pool, like once or twice a month during the summer, he would suddenly have it closed for maintenance, or he'd claim there was a chemical imbalance and it wasn't safe to swim. It became almost comical how many excuses he'd come up with, each more contrived than the last. If I showed up unannounced, following the proper notice protocols in the contract, Marvin would be conveniently absent, the gate would be locked, and no one would answer the door. If I showed up with a letter from Tristan, then magically the gate would open. I decided for my own sanity not to fight every minor inconvenience he threw my way. After all, the $15,000 was already a strong warning. If he pushed me too far again, we could always revisit the court. My friend Colton joked that Marvin was probably trying to find a way to sabotage the pool just so he'd have an excuse to fill it in and avoid me using it. But we all agreed that this was more trouble for him than it was worth. He spent a fortune building that pool, plus the $90,000 in total he paid me. If he really tried to demolish it, that would be his own loss. He'd never get that money back. So he's stuck with a pool on my land which he can't really keep me away from, and which cost him an arm and a leg to install plus the legal fees. The fallout from this whole debacle also rippled out to some local acquaintances. Marvin's reputation as a contractor took a hit because word got around that he had tried to muscle in on someone else's land. A few folks in the neighborhood started questioning the ethics of hiring him for jobs, wondering if he'd cut corners or try something similarly shady. He still has his loyal clientele, but from what I hear, he's struggled to land big contracts in our area for a while. It turns out that this fiasco was not just a petty neighbor dispute. It had real consequences for his business, and I can't say I feel sorry for him. Meanwhile, I've used the pool a handful of times. Ironically, it is pretty nice. He spared no expense on the materials, installed a good filtration system, and even set up a little pool house with a mini fridge. The water is always kept at a decent temperature, and there's a decent deck area around it. It feels strange swimming there, knowing the bizarre circumstances of its existence, but I figure I might as well enjoy what I'm legally entitled to. Some of my friends still can't believe the story when they hear it. They tease me about having a free pool, although I always remind them it wasn't free in principle. Marvin had to learn the hard way about boundaries. One interesting subplot that emerged shortly after the second lawsuit involved my cousin Loretta, who moved to a house about 5 miles away. Loretta is a real estate agent, and when she got wind of the drama, she insisted on helping me do a full survey of my property to avoid any future land disputes with other neighbors. We ended up hiring an independent surveyor to confirm every boundary line and stake. During that process, we discovered another small discrepancy on the opposite side of my land, near a local farmer's field. Unlike Marvin, that farmer was really gracious. When we pointed out the issue, he apologized and shifted his fence about 3 feet. That was that. No drama, no lawsuits. The difference in neighborly attitudes couldn't have been starker. Loretta also got me thinking about the broader potential of my property. She told me that if I ever wanted to develop a small outdoor event space, like for weddings, picnics, or something that took advantage of the scenic views, I should have no problem getting the permits. She said half-jokingly, "You could even build your own pool, far away from Marvin, so you can avoid dealing with him at all." The idea tempted me, but at the time I didn't have the capital or the energy to embark on such a project. It did feel like a bit of sweet satisfaction, though, imagining how Marvin might react if I built an even bigger, more luxurious pool that overshadowed his. But I'm not that petty. I just want to live peacefully on my land. Our district's Loose Homeowners Association, HOA, set aesthetics and environmental guidelines, adding another thread to this story. My home is far from the main cluster of houses, so most HOA rules don't affect me. They did question whether Marvin's pool met environmental water drainage and runoff guidelines. He hadn't applied for a pool of that size by the proper channels. Not surprising since he built it secretly. He paid several $1,000s in HOA fines for non-compliance. He claimed that the HOA wouldn't have discovered his construction if I hadn't noticed. It's his fault for not following the process. I admit that this whole thing was a pain. Dealing with courts, lawyers, and an antagonistic neighbor took up my free time and stressed out my home life. However, this experience taught me to protect your property rights, be diligent about documentation, and never assume that a neighbor, no matter how friendly, won't try something shady if they think they can get away with it. I also learned that sometimes letting people like Marvin dig their own hole is better than yelling. He built the pool and paid me a small fortune by doubling down on his arrogance. One day after the second lawsuit, Colton and I were walking in the same area where we first heard construction noises. Only now was a finished pool shining in the sun. Colton asked, "Life is weird, huh?" You and I laughed. Indeed, I never thought I would own land with someone else's swimming pool, which I could use under a legal agreement, the oddest arrangement. But the cards fell that way. People occasionally ask if I'd sell Marvin that corner of my property to end the drama. The law may allow me to subdivide, and he could get the deed if he paid enough. I like having that leverage, though. I doubt he'd be a good neighbor if he owned that land. We have a precedent for how the courts will handle his antics if he acts out again. I keep that land in my name as a precaution. I may as well keep it worthless and drive Marvin up a wall. A few months after that last court win, my life returned to normal. I work from home some days and volunteer at an animal shelter on others. On weekends, I host gatherings or invite friends and family to explore my woods. People sometimes ask if we can use that neighbor's pool, and I have to decide if it's worth it. If Marvin's family sees me near the fence, they still look at me dirty, and I don't like forcing my way in even though I'm eligible. In the event that Marvin forbids me from swimming, I now have a proven way to remind him of the court's decision. My home's interior was renovated with $75,000 and part of the additional $15,000. I thought, why not buy something nice for myself? I renovated my kitchen, upgraded the appliances, and painted several rooms to brighten it. I also repaved my narrow driveway with some of it. I can fit more cars when family and friends visit. A small but welcome improvement. Some might think I should have done something extravagant or taken a big vacation, but I'm a homebody who loves creature comforts. Looking back, Marvin's audacity amazes me. Building a pool on someone else's land without permission sounds too crazy to be true. But here we are, living the aftermath. I suspect Marvin thought he could strong-arm me because I was new to the area. Maybe he thought I wouldn't notice or care about that remote corner of my property. Perhaps he had done something similar on a smaller scale before and gotten away with it. Regardless, he found his match. Some town rumors say Marvin wanted that pool for big weekend parties. He hosts lavish parties to impress business clients. Apparently, his show-off routine included a flashy in-ground pool. He got his pool, but it cost more than most people would have tolerated. Instead of bragging, he's been more low-key, likely because he doesn't want to explain why he doesn't own the land. Another side story occurred a year after the second lawsuit when my sister Danielle visited for 2 weeks. She loves swimming and was excited to try the pool after hearing the crazy backstory. I politely requested the pool on a Saturday afternoon from Marvin. I got the usual runaround. No answer, locked gate. This time, I was ready. I knocked on his door with the contract and my camera. He wouldn't open the door, but I saw him through the curtains. After a few minutes of me standing there with my phone, ready to call Tristan if he ignored me, he opened up. He murmured, "Fine, just don't make a mess." We swam for 30 minutes with my sister and left everything clean. It was strangely satisfying but forced, like I was there to prove a point. Was, sort of. Danielle found everything hilarious. "You have a neighbor's pool on your property that you can barely use without a legal standoff," she joked. "We could bypass Marvin's yard by building a second gate from my side," she suggested. I mentioned that to Tristan and he said it might be possible, but it could violate the spirit of the agreement because it would be seen as me trying to create an easement that wasn't in the contract. Tristan added, Do you really want to spend more money just to have direct access to a pool you barely care about? He was right. Sometimes a troublesome neighbor isn't worth any more trouble. Soon after that incident, a local journalist who covers neighborhood disputes asked me to write a feature on conflicts over property lines. She learned about my case from public records. She wanted names and details, but I politely declined. I wanted less drama and publicity. I just wanted to live. She respected my decision, but said, "Stories like yours are fascinating because they show what can happen when neighbors don't communicate or respect boundaries." I concurred. Definitely a warning. After the shock of Marvin's actions wore off, the whole thing became a quirky anecdote. If new people ask about my property and want weird neighbor stories, I have a lot to share. You almost have to see it to believe it. Some ask if I regret not forcing Marvin to remove the pool. I sometimes do, especially when tensions rise. However, $75,000 was a lot of money, and I worried that a fight over demolishing the pool would cause more problems. If I had insisted on removal, Marvin might have tried everything to prolong litigation. It gave me something and prevented a long fight about bulldozing the place. The second $15,000 was icing on the cake, showing Marvin's inability to learn. Because of this, I've become more vocal about property rights in my community. I've advised several neighbors to update surveys and organize their paperwork. I volunteer at a local legal clinic once a month to connect people with real estate attorneys. My personal experiences taught me how important it is to know your deeds, boundaries, and rights, even though I never studied law. Interestingly, I rarely see Marvin use the pool anymore, which is bittersweet. He's either lost interest or so frustrated with the arrangement that he can't look at it. I occasionally see a gathering in his backyard, but it rarely spills into the pool. Perhaps he's using it only with close friends and avoiding me. He told a neighbor that he feels robbed because he can't control pool users. Ironic, since he tried to steal my land. Despite the drama, I'm grateful. My love of nature and home have paid off in many ways. While the pool was never my dream addition, it shows how far some people will go when they think they can get away with something. If Marvin does this again, I'll stand firm. I have every right to defend my land. Friends, thank you. See you soon.